All right. Be fun. This is probably, we'll end up, I think we're just going to, from here out, my assumption at this point, unless anyone objects, is we're doing the close reading like we've been doing. I think up to this point, the pieces have been short enough, and I think discussions have been more worthy than doing a close reading because we've been able to go back. There's so much in every one of these paragraphs that it's worth doing the proper close reading, spending time with every line, and I think that it's worth doing. So that's, I just figure at this point we're just going to be diving in and doing that from here out is my assumption.
I think that sounds a good idea.
All right, let's get Alistair in here and then we'll kick off.
Now recording.
Excellent. Backup's going, recording's going, everything's set. We're getting moving a little bit forward, which is nice. I guess I'll go ahead and kick us off then. And people will join if they decide to. I want to get into this because Phantasm's probably one of the more interesting new concepts to me. Hey, Varun, welcome.
Hey.
All right. Well, thank you and good morning and hello to everyone. Welcome to the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Logic of Sense. Today we're moving into Series 30, the series of the Phantasm. I found this series to be incredibly interesting. The first time I went through this, which was about a year ago, I didn't fully grasp this. I think this reading has really helped me get a shitload more out of specifically this series and the following few. This has been wonderful to get through, but I think I don't have any announcements or anything major today. Anyone have any major announcements or things to mention before we do anything? Fair enough. For the rest of this reading, my assumption is we're going to basically be going through like we do similar to our Anti-Oedipus. I'm going to read through a paragraph. We'll spend a little bit of time going back through it, reviewing some of the lines, talking through it, trying to suss out some sort of understanding, and then move on and continue to sort of dive through. So with no further ado, I'll get right into doing that. The phantasm has three main characteristics. 1. It represents neither an action nor a passion, but a result of action and passion, that is, a pure event. The question of whether particular events are real or imaginary is poorly posed. The distinction is not between the imaginary and the real, but between the event as such and the corporeal state of affairs which incites it about or in which it is actualized. Events are effects, thus, for example, the castration effect, the parricide effect. But insofar as they are effects, they must be tied not only with endogenous causes, but with exogenous causes as well, effective states of affairs, actions really undertaken, and passions or contemplations effectively actualized. Freud was then right to maintain the rights of reality in the production of phantasms, even when he recognized them as products transcending reality. It would be unfortunate if we were to forget or feign to forget that children do observe their parents' bodies and parental coitus, that they really become the object of seduction on the part of adults, that they are subjected to precise and detailed threats of castration, etc. Moreover, parricide, incest, poisoning, and eventration are not exactly absent from public and private histories. The fact is, though, that phantasms, even when they are effects, and because they are effects, differ in nature from their real causes. We speak of endogenous causes, hereditary constitution, phylogenetic heritage, internal evolution of sexuality, introjected actions and passions, no less than we speak of exogenous causes. The phantasm, like the event which it represents, is a noematic attribute, distinguished not only from states of affairs and their qualities, but from the psychological lives and from logical concepts as well. It belongs, as such, to an ideational surface over which it is produced as an effect. It transcends inside and outside, since its topological property is to bring its internal and external sides into contact, in order for them to unfold onto a single side. This is why the phantasm event is submitted to a double causality, referring to the external and external causes whose result in depth it is, and also to a quasi-cause, which enacts it at the surface and brings it into communication with all the other event phantasms. We have already twice seen how the place was prepared for such effects, differing in nature from that whose result they are. The first time, in the case of the depressive position, when the cause withdrew into the heights and left the field free for the development of a surface yet to come. Later on, in the case of the Oedipal situation, when intention left the field free for the result of an entirely different nature, where the phallus plays the role, the quasi-cause. We'll kick it off. Here we're talking at this point, I think, only about the first characteristic. He goes on for a little bit of the first characteristic of the phantasm. That is that it is this pure event. It is different in nature than bodies and real causes. It sits in a different place. That's a little top line. Would anyone want to dive in a little bit here and talk through it?
So he says it represents neither an action or a passion. So so I think with the idea of action, we can think in terms of a bodily engagement with passion, result of that action. So it's something that comes out of that interaction, that a result of action and passion. So therefore, it is a pure event, as we've already seen. He goes on to say the question whether it's. So he's now kind of just talking particularly about events. So whether particular events are real or imaginary, poorly posed. So this notion of whether they're real or whether they are imaginary is not really the question, I would say. So it's not the distinction is not between the imaginary and real, but between the event as such and the corporeal state of affairs which incites it or in which it is actualized. So it's between event as this thing, as this, let's call it a freestanding thing, and the bodily state of affairs which incites it, in which it is actualized. So the thing which brings about the event, the corporeal state of affairs, which brings about or in which it is actualized. So it has two things there. I think there is the idea of an event. An event can be a bodily event. It can, which is something we haven't really spoken. It comes up now and again, but it also can be the result of an event. So an event, so it can be this thing that comes out, this action and passion. He says the events are going on, so events are effects. So it gives an example of effects: castration effect, the parricide effect. So he said that, and now he's linking the effects to their causes. So he said that they must not only be tied to internal endogenous causes, but with external causes as well. And the external cause, again, is the state of affairs, effective states of affairs. States of affairs that bring about an effect, they're effective. So actions really, so the word really, again, I think refers to this notion of the real, actions really undertaken, and passions or, which is, again, the action and the passions, contemplations effectively actualized. He's kind of, again, he's threading through between this relationship between the real and, in this case, the actual. He goes on then to say it was right to maintain the rights of reality in the production of phantasms. So there is a role for reality in the production of phantasm when he recognizes them as products, but even when he recognizes them as they actually transcend reality. there's a kind of, again, this relationship between the real and something beyond reality.
Varun, you had a thought? Or not? Fair enough.
Just the next section, he then kind of examples of how reality is part of the kind of formation of phantasms by this reference to children and their kind of relationship to the parents.
Well, and it's here where we start talking about the endogenous and exogenous, because prior to this earlier part, he's talking about the exogenous causes, the effective states of affairs, the actions undertaken, passions or contemplations effectively actualized, and he runs through that. And the line here, it would be unfortunate if we were to forget or feign to forget, like fake it, that children do observe their parental bodies, that they really become the object of seduction on the part of adults, that there is this, I think still he's talking here about exogenous causes. And then he moves in to endogenous causes, no less important, and the endogenous causes of hereditary constitution, phylogenetic heritage, internal evolution of sexuality, internal to the, how do I put this? Specifically internal or exogenous, internal or external to what would be my question, I guess, here. Because is it external to the effects at the phantasm, or is it external to the subject that it's taking place in?
I think it's sorry, the
phrasing here is just really weird to me. Sorry.
Sorry, can you just point to that again, please? Sorry.
So this paragraph is about the exogenous and endogenous causes that they are sort of tied in with. And he says, we speak of endogenous causes no less than we speak of exogenous. Then he sort of goes on a little bit more. He's been talking about endogenous prior to that, and then he outlines a few. He's been talking about exogenous. What are they endogenous or exogenous to? Exogenous or endogenous causes to the phantasm, or to the surface of sense, or to the subject? What is the point of reference to say endogenous or exogenous?
The way I read that was it's exogenous and endogenous to the infant who gives rise to the phantasm. I mean, what is the line I think he's developing here? He's saying that because he said just prior to this that reality. So he says Freud was right to maintain the rights of reality in the production of phantasms, even when the products transcending reality. I think this is an example he's giving of the child, and so the infant, I would say, the infant, and they're kind of there's something internal to the child and external. And so what's internal is the hereditary constitution. He gives those examples, phylogenetic, but what's extrinsic is the parents, is the kind of witnessing of the parents. So this is why I would read that. So I think this is what gives, this is, again, it's these two things, that an action and a passion. It's given off the phantasm as an event, as a pure event.
Jack or Varun, did you have something to say there? I notice you typing a lot. You're free to jump in.
Yeah, sorry, I'm on my phone today because of Wi-Fi issues and that. But yeah, I think you're asking a really good question, because it is kind of weird how he's laying it out here in terms of the flow. I'm almost reading it backwards, and I think it's the endogenous and exogenous, just in a very basic corporal sense, right? So hereditary constitution, phylogenetic heritage, internal evolution of sexuality, and so on, introjection. It seems like this is him going back to this distinction between the corporal states of affairs that either incite the event or the corporal state of affairs in which the event is actualized, right? So the endogenous seems to be part of the inciting, right? So it's just bodily, in a sense, it's bodily causality, right? I mean, that's kind of probably a little too simplified, but for our purposes, right? That which incites the event from bodies, or that which takes on the actualization of the event, which would seem to be the exogenous.
Yeah, I guess I'm having trouble with the wording around that because that's fine. It's fine. I'll have to spend a little bit more time on it. It's okay.
I think what he's doing is, as just a bit later on in this paragraph, he's distinguishing. Well, he's distinguishing what he calls what we'll soon call the inside, the internal and external, inside and outside. I think, I'm not sure. Anyway, the internal and external. The event brings these together. I think that's the nature of the event. It brings those two together on a single surface, basically. The phantasm-like event, which it represents, is a nomadic attribute distinguished only from the states of affairs and their qualities, from psychological lives, from logical concepts as well. So it's kind of distinguished from these two kind of things, which are distinguished. It's distinguishing between these two things. The inside and the outside, or the internal and external, are distinguished from each other, but the phantasm is also distinguished from them as well. So and he says basically, so the phantasm is a nomadic attribute. It's kind of an idea of thought. I think it's difficult to kind of say exactly what that means, but it's almost like a thought that's given off. It said it belongs to an ideational surface, and again, the reference to ideation, I would say, is again relating to thought. I mean, we did in the previous series, thought was arrived towards the end. It belongs to an ideational surface which is produced as an effect. So this is the relationship that's being set up. It transcends inside and outside. Since its topological property is to bring its internal and external sides into contact, in order for them to unfold into a single side. This is what I would say. This is what it does. It's bringing these two together. So he sets up these two things. These two things are distinguished from each other, but then they're brought back together. The phantasm, which is an event which has one side.
So this one side. So to go back to my earlier question and thought, it's ultimately, it's not so much about the exogenous or endogenous. It's that those two elements end up getting sort of woven together into a single side. There is no inside or outside of the phantasm. It only has this one side that we're seeing effectively.
That's right. Yeah, that's what I would say. Yeah.
And because of that, that's why it has and that's the line. This is why it has that double causality, referring to internal and external causes, whose result in depth it is, and also to the quasi-cause, which enacts it at the surface and brings it into communication with other event phantasms. Okay, that makes more sense. Okay. But it plays inside of that. That's interesting.
I think this has been the structure of the event that's been repeated. It's a repetition of the structure of the event, which he likened quite early on to the Mobius strip. So it always has one side. It doesn't have a back and it's an object without a back and front. It's on any one side.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. I do think it's still bringing in the endogenous and the exogenous, right? Because that's the distinction that Deleuze is focusing on as opposed to the imaginary and the real. But I think it's those two things that you're seeing connected there, right? That's going to produce this fold and everything. Because the weird thing about this is it almost looks on one hand like the event is in between them, but at the same time, there's something that has to be brought up from the depths, right? So there's this interesting, I almost think of it like chambers, but it's probably a bit misleading, but there's this interesting migration going on, and it seems to be both outside the external, but coming into the in between of the external and the internal, but then to transcend it and at the same time bring them together, right? It's it's kind of a weird thing to put together in your head.
Well, and it's this thing that does that, again, the external or internal causes, whose resultant depth it is, and also to the quasi-cause, which I think this is where we start getting into what I really love about this concept of the phantasm, because the quasi-cause enacts it at the surface and brings it into communication. It, at this point, the phantasms begin to communicate, and to go back to the communication of events and how that sort of has its knock-on effects. It's a really interesting way that he's bringing it about, merging the endogenous and exogenous. Okay, it's starting to piece together. This is fascinating. Pardon me. Sorry for that weird little ramble. I like that. Hmm. Hmm.
And it just gives two previous examples of this structure. So he talks about the depressive position, which we saw previously, when the cause withdrew into the heights and left the field free for development of the surface yet to come. And the second one, the case of the Oedipal situation, when intention is left field free for result of an entirely different nature. And that phallus plays the role of a quasi-cause. So these are obviously referring back to previous, quite recent examples he's given.
Which is also an interesting, the idea that the phantasm is effectively created at the surface in sort of a power vacuum, as the the event or cause moves its way up the surface, or that the intention is left the field free for the phallus to play the role of quasi-cause. A really fascinating way to think about that. Well,
It's also very strange. As I was reading this, I was actually really surprised to see Deleuze talking about the phantasm as representation, and this part too, where you've got this, if you like this kind of object, I hate to call it that, but it seems like you've got this kind of object going into the transcendental, right, and kind of more or less going into the effectual or the event, but it comes with a certain tension now that we just read all this material in psychoanalysis, and you think about Lacan and anti-Oedipus and some of the material dealing with this, and it's very interesting to read this discussion how something becoming transcendental, right, is also at the same time produced by the real, so as to produce the phantasm, right, products transcending reality, as he says.
and it's when you start talking about, because again, the idea that effectively this quasi-cause pushes this phantasm into the communication of events. The real interesting thing when we talk about how events sort of talk about or communicate, it's effectively more about the wording, compatibility and incompatibility, whether or not they just seem to sort of work together, and the idea that the phantasm is able to enter that, have its quasi-cause force it to interplay, and then at that point you're effectively finding pieces or other events that may or may not be compatible or compossible or incompossible. I think he also uses the phrasing, with this now generated event this phantasm as one of those compossible or incompossible things, sort of a self-selection bias, you might say. The interesting conception around it too. Yeah, I kind of want to move to the next paragraph now. Anything left for this paragraph? Anyone have questions or thoughts or anything? And Riveth, you're not muting yourself. I'm going to leave you muted. Let me know if you want to talk in the chat. But to continue, neither active nor passive, neither internal nor external, neither imaginary nor real, phantasms have indeed the impassibility and ideality of the event. In light of this impassibility, they inspire in us an unbearable waiting. The waiting of that which is going to come about as a result, and also that which is already in the process of coming about and never stops coming about. What is psychoanalysis talking about with its grand trinity of murder, incest, castration, or of devouring, eventration, adsorption, if not about pure events? Isn't this the case of all events in one as in the wound? Totem and taboo is the great theory of the event, and psychoanalysis in general is the science of events, on the condition that the event should not be treated as something whose sense is to be sought and disentangled. The event is sense itself, insofar as it is disengaged or distinguished from the states of affairs which produce it, in which it is actualized. Over states of affairs and their depth, their mixtures, and their actions and passions, psychoanalysis casts the most intense light in order to reach the point of emergence of that which results, that is, the event of another type, as a surface effect. Therefore, whatever may be the importance of the earlier positions, or the necessity of always connecting the event to its causes, psychoanalysis is correct to recall the role of Oedipus as a nuclear complex, a formula which has the same importance as Husserl's noematic core. For it is with Oedipus that the event is disengaged from its causes in depth, spreads itself at the surface, and connects itself with its quasi-cause from the point of view of a dynamic genesis. It is the perfect crime, the eternal truth, the royal splendor of the event, each one of which communicates with all the others in the variance of one and the same phantasm. It is as distinct from its actualization as from the causes which produce it, using to its advantage the eternal part of excess over these causes, and the part which is left unaccomplished in its actualizations, skimming over its own field, making us its own offspring. And if it is indeed at the point where the actualization cannot accomplish, or the cause produce, that the entire event resides, it is at the same point also that it offers itself to counter-actualization. It is here that our greatest freedom lies, the freedom by which we develop and lead the event to its completion and transmutation, and finally become masters of actualizations and causes. As the science of pure events, psychoanalysis is also an art of counter-actualizations, sublimations, and symbolizations. This beginning here, I didn't intend to sort of lead into that, but it's this really fascinating thing. Phantasms have indeed the impassibility and ideality of event. The phantasms essentially can exist and play inside of the same space that an event that's actually connected to causes, or that is actually generated through what we might say I don't want to say the proper use of it, but it feels like there's a sort of line there. I don't know, Derek, Jack, feel free to correct me. There's this like new thing that's now generated, this phantasm that now exists, that we've created, and it still behaves as if it was an event, as if it was like actually connected. And within itself, we also still have these other side powers that he's talked about within, because it behaves the same way. We have actualization or counter-actualization that can happen. An interesting, I just thought I'd mention that. Am I reading that close? I really like that opening couple lines here.
I think so. I would probably say that it's something creating us, and yet at the same time, like you're saying, we do still have the ability to be involved in the production of that creation, and yet at the same time also like the counter actualization of it, right? It's kind of weird how he builds this out, but yeah, I think you're spot on. This is getting into a larger part of the ethics, right? The whole idea of the operator and the quasi-cause.
I think his description at the beginning is the description of an event, so it's neither active nor passive, internal or external, neither imaginary nor real, which is something he said in the previous paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
And he says phantasms have the impassibility and ideality of the event, so they have this structure of impassibility. They're not subject to passions, shall we say? They're the result of passion, but they're not subject to them. And they also have this ideality, so they have a kind of existence as a kind of a thought. I think the idea of saying ideality and thought, I don't think is correct, but it's just the easiest way I can think to say it, really. Then like this impassibility, they inspire us an unbearable waiting for what is going to result and what is already in process and never stops occurring. That I find slightly impenetrable, I would say, in light of this not being subject to passions.
It's disconnected from these things. That's, I think, the event itself is sense almost disengaged from states of affairs. It's separated from the passions. That's the nature of sort of the event itself. And here we have one that has a quasi-cause. It's not even born of the passions. It's not born of the states of affairs. It's now its own element, its own setup that kind of, even though it behaves pretty much identical to it as if it was a replicant rather than a birthed human in the space, it still behaves, and we can't really tell the difference of it except that it wasn't born of it, that it is naturally disconnected. That would be my response.
I think what the question to answer about this paragraph is, what is it talking about? I think that for me, that's the kind of question. I think what it's essentially saying, I think, is how are they produced, and what's their usage, shall I almost. I think for me, reading, it seems that it's a kind of essential. It's an event of psychoanalysis, something that's central to psychoanalysis. I think that's what's being said here. I think because right the last in the final sentence, he says that psychoanalysis is a science of pure events. So, and therefore, it is also an art of counter-actualization, sublimation, symbolizations. And I get a feeling that phantasm is a kind of product almost of psychoanalysis.
I would agree. I would add a caveat that it's not a product only of psychoanalysis, but that's what psychoanalysis produces. I think you're right there. And I think within that, it's the way that psychoanalysis behaves. He's kind of going again back to the previous series about Oedipus and good intentions, and how essentially at this point, what psychoanalysis does is it disengages events from their real causes, moves it across the surfaces, and connects it with quasi-causes. It basically creates these phantasms through this nature, but at the same time, because of sort of its power here, it, as the science of pure events, which is what psychoanalysis is, it also is an art of counter-actualization and also this freeing sort of thing, which is an interesting sort of thing. It can do both.
I mean, I would correct something you said. I don't think they're not the real. It's not being separate from the real. I think the real is it comes out of the real. I would say the phantasm. I mean, it quotes from Freud saying that exactly that. So I think I get a feeling reading this paragraph, the way you read it, Brooks. I think what's being spoken about is that kind of its role in psychoanalysis. And it's almost, if we think the notion of a series, and he gave two examples, or he probably gave more than two, but one I remember is the purloined letter, the two opposing series. He also gave an example from Jacques Lacan. So kind of this takes us into another realm of, you might almost say fiction, but I'd be reluctant to say that. But it's a kind of narrative around, I would say it's a narrative around phantasms and how they're produced. And one suspects they're produced in therapy, perhaps. I mean, I know that isn't said here, so perhaps I'm going too far. But it seems to be saying that psychoanalysis is science of pure events, which I take to mean it's a kind of study. It will study pure events, the science of, but it's also an art of counter-relaxation, sublimation, symbolization. These are things through which events are activated, shall we say, and as an art, so that it's something that produces something.
May I jump in here?
Please, please.
Well, it's good to join in. So listening to what you guys have expounded upon, I just want to sort of dilate out and get a wider scope for just a minute and say that it seems that within the last two paragraphs, if I could do a sort of mini critique, that what came to mind for me was, excuse me, was trying to situate Deleuze historically in his event, in his moment. Again, sort of in conjunction with these last two sections that we've read. One is the historical moment or event where I think there is a demand or an intentionality on the part of Deleuze to situate himself and critique Klein and Lacan. So it may be that you guys agree with me there, and I'm just rehashing the given, but I think that there is a attempt on the part of Deleuze here in his writing to have some contention and extrapolate himself, and have his work extrapolate a position. It's positioning himself once again and elevating himself properly, I think, in a positive way amidst Klein and Lacan. So that's my first point of the critique. My mini critique is that there's a historical positioning that Deleuze is doing. And the second part, I'm not sure whether you guys, whether the word that's used is compossibility, which is a trope that would refer to Leibniz, if that's the term he uses, because I don't have the text in front of me, or whether it's compassibility or composability. But if it is compossibility,
Impassibility.
No, I accidentally used incompossibility a bit earlier. So he does go through and bring out Leibniz in an earlier series. So I was using that in reference to that. Here, though, I misused it. That was the mistake on me. That was on me. It was the impassibility of it is what he's discussing here as well.
I see. So and then I must have misheard or misunderstood that particular moment, but it would be it would have been more interesting if he did do some sort of Leibnizian turn here. My second point, though, without getting too far off, that I was thinking about was, well, this whole text itself is a kind of oscillation or a move out of the static image of the Mobius strip and a kind of at play with the text itself is moving in and out of this type of topology in these last two readings, and very much reminds me, especially after hearing you read it, Brooks, this second section of Anti-Oedipus. And it's interesting because it has been written so many years prior to Anti-Oedipus that here is Deleuze tarrying with psychoanalysis. And my reading in listening to you, and also, in listening to you recite the text, is that psychoanalysis itself, Deleuze is also trying to convey, and based on the tone of your reading, it seems to me that psychoanalysis itself is the quasi-cause. It's far from the notion that he makes of a pure science. And I think that he is in fact writing and playing out the idea that this is a quasi-cause, that this is a myth constructing representational attempt at a system. But again, it's the myth and the quasi-cause that psychoanalysis narrates in this construction of the various tropes, the murder, castration, I forget what the third one is there, this oedipalization. It's all the creation of a quasi-cause and myth. And in these last two readings, Deleuze is pointing out, again, the problem is that he gets enrolled in it. He gets rolled up in it, which is part of what psychoanalysis does in its own machinic way. Gets rolled up in the process of creating representation, but you cannot remove yourself from the gravitas of representation in the creation of a text. So,
well, and I think you're right in the sense that the timing of this, I think he is tarrying with what was, beyond clear at the time, Lacan and Klein and psychoanalysis being, we'll just say, deeply influential into the entire French critical theory sphere, for sure. I think there's a bit here to go back to one of the things you had said about psychoanalysis being the quasi-cause or how it plays. I like that, and I think I want a slight twist on it because I was reading just a part here real quick. The lines he uses is he talks about Oedipus as he talked about Hercules as the hero of the surface, but is with Oedipus that the event is disengaged from its causes. It spreads itself at the surface and connects itself with the quasi-cause from the point of view of a dynamic genesis. And the dynamic genesis, as we've talked about in the last few series, I think it was within orality and sexuality, the dynamic genesis that begins with language and this univocity of the schizoid system, but through sexuality, we have the formation of the surfaces and the coordination of these surfaces and how they sort of play together. At this point, because again, we're talking about from the point of view of the dynamic genesis, the Oedipal element takes the event, disconnects it, and reconnects it to what it needs to through this dynamic genesis. And through this, the phrasing he's got, through the royal splendor of the event, each one of which communicates with all the others in the variance of one and the same phantasm. Now you have this one sort of central hub phantasm that everything's communicating through. And again, how events communicate, and this is why I brought up Leibniz quite as necessary. It's compatibility or incompatibility with these events. We're now playing in the place of Does it work? The phantasm is there. Do things fit with it we're now playing with? And that puts us in a unique spot. And I think it's a significant critique of psychoanalysis, but also he's right in that this becomes a counteractualization as well if done correctly.
The that there seems to be some remnant within the text there, a reference to some phenomenology. I think what was read there was a mentioning of Husserl, and it sort of weaved around the notion there of intentionality. And what representation came to my mind, and again, representations themselves are problematic, and so we have this nested kind of problematization here, is intentionality. It's kind of one of the problems in the duality, this dynamics of the duality that's presented.
And that duality, I mean that the duality and the bring up of intention. Thank you for that. It's I think, I mean, it makes me connect a few things. The intention, as he talked about in the previous series, and Derek, Kent, Jack, feel free to jump in and say where I'm wrong. But intentionality, essentially as a category, projects every possible action and then divides it. Because again, this is now the third step of the dynamic genesis, effectively, because this sort of element that happens here is we take that physical surface and it becomes this metaphysical surface, the double screen, one of the physical surface, the willed and determined, or the metaphysical surface as produced, determined by murder and castration, that double surface. And so, this is actually what's tying in maybe with the way he's talking about endogenous and exogenous as well, and then the basically unification of those into a single surface, which is now this phantasm. Interesting. Derek, thoughts? Jack? Kent?
I have one last thing to add.
Sure.
I lied and said that I had one last thing last time.
Go for it.
One last thing for this phase, though, was Derek had mentioned something about the removing of the passions and elevating the thought as the premise for the event, or something having to do with that, a kind of that the event was predicated on the thought as opposed to the passion. And I would say that, again, psychoanalysis would quickly come to bring a representation there. And that is what we are tearing with here as the phantasm. So the problem with the exclusion of the passions, or the sort of neutralization of it for some reason, is, is an area of contention, both on a phenomenological level, a certain phenomenology that would deal with affects, and what I'm trying to say here is that the way of the passions and having a investigation of the passions is an important part of the event. And I'm not sure yet whether Deleuze is a very important part of the logic of the sense. And I'm not sure if Deleuze is going to take that route just yet around affectivity. I think what's happening here is that Deleuze is caught in the web of psychoanalytic representations, and that he is trying to reformulate his way out of it. And now we are dealing with the phantasm part, and he's tearing with Lacan and bringing the Mobius strip to mind as an image. But he's struggling and he's going to continue to struggle if he doesn't make a case for the passions as it relates to sense and the logic of sense.
I'd be a little careful there because he does talk about passions, right? But the passions are at the corporal level. So he writes effective states of affairs, actions really undertaken in passions or contemplations effectively actualized, right? So that is there, but that's not necessarily at the event, although it's caught up in the production of the event, and the event will do things to those passions.
I think what I was saying is that the phantasm as an event, he says that the phantasm is an event, and therefore it is impassable. Has two qualities or two characteristics. One is impassable, and one it has the quality or the characteristic of being idealities. So it's a kind of it's resistant to the passions. It's not. It comes out of passions, or it comes out of it's given off by bodies and their passions. It's not subject itself to them. And it also has this ideality, which you can kind of say it's like a thought. It's again something beyond the bodies. We have this sort of kind of hierarchical structure of bodies interacting, that kind of passions that they give rise to, from which is the event. That's the event. So one of the key points he makes, and he keeps making it, he's made it here again.
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether this whether this impassable event as phantasm is it seems that the case is being made that it's an event of
I think part of the difficulty here is we have to do a lot of qualification when we say, I mean, at some level maybe it is thought, but he's got a very precise term, which is noma, right? He's going into Husserl and that. And I don't think he's trying to elevate it, but if I remember correctly, he's introduced thought, particularly noma, as being produced in this process, right? Which is very interesting. I won't go anything further on that point. But this point about the impassibility and that, I mean, this does sound right to me because in so far as the internal and the external, right? What were the terms he used? I think I think it's basically that which is productive of the event in a corporal sense, and that in which the event will be actualized. Yeah. Insofar as the event is somehow in relation to those two causalities, right? This double causality. I do think this point about the event is right, and I think this is why he's going to psychoanalysis. It's usually considered a means of getting at the unconscious of the individual, whether in a social context or otherwise, right? But Deleuze isn't talking about putting somebody on the chair here, let alone a group of people per se. He's engaging psychoanalysis, I think, as a way to get at how the collective of basically a corporeal collectivity, right? A bodily collectivity, a group of bodies and their mixture, how that can be understood in relation to effects and events. And when he does that, this point about impassibility, this does seem right to me because you can see the Freudian influence of tension and release throughout this section. And this point about the impassibility seems to be just that to me. There's something which is in relation to the mixture of bodies, right? and at the same time that which will be actualized in the bodies. So you'll have the fallback on the children of the event, right? That eternalates us, but you'll also have the way in which an actualization can take place. And this seems to be the point about the sublimation in that to me, is what he seems to be saying here with psychoanalysis is that there's a way in which it can be applied to the event, which he's already argued through. I won't reiterate it, but there's a way in which psychoanalysis can be applied here so as to understand the event in terms of a kind of unconscious theory, but at the same time, a way in which that the event taken as something unconscious in this impassibility, right, can be understood in terms of its, right, I mean, we've got actualization, so you think about latency and manifestation, sublimation. How does the event go into this point about not being released, but also finding its release, right? And that would be at the bodily level, particularly how it's going to affect that. Symbolizations and that, which is interesting because that draws to mind like a more Jungian thing. But as I read these two paragraphs, that's where I see him going, and the way in which the operator can be involved in a process of freedom, right, during that during the event's relationship to the double causality.
I think fundamentally what he's saying in this section 1, so we've got Phantasm's 3 characteristics, and this is the first one. Just to return to the right at the very beginning, it represents neither an action nor a passion. It doesn't, not there standing in for an action or standing in for a passion. It's a result of action and passion. So these two things working together. And I think just going, so that's right at the beginning, going right to the end of this section, as a science of pure. So what psychoanalysis studies phantasms. It studies these events. It also, it's an art of counteractualization, sublimation, symbolization, for ways in which these phantasms can be enacted. I'm trying to think of a better word than that, but the example we had of a counteractualization earlier was the actor who, in playing a part, is in a counteractualization. I think these are all ways, these 3 examples it gives, counteractualization, sublimation, and symbolization, all kind of, in a sense, explanations almost on the phantasm. They're almost, so it's an art of counteractualization, an art of sublimation, an art of symbolization. So they tie the noematic thing to its expression, I would say. It's how is this expressed? How are these phantasms expressed? That's what I would say is being said there.
I think I can dig that, right? And this expression, I think we have to walk a little bit further because we're still in this distinction between the inciting and the actualized, right? Or the endogenous and the exogenous, or the endogenous and the exogenous, right? And I think this is where the event is really taking us in this first section, is this point about freedom and that, and actualization and counter-actualization, right? The inciting of the event and also its actualization. The way in which it can be actualized, but at the same time, this point about kind of the unactualized, which I do think actually does get into some compossibility, to Bert's point earlier. The way in which that which is unactualized here actually still sort of falls back on the bodies, if you like. I don't necessarily mean in a BWO way, but still affects them, right? This point about potentiality is still very much present. And I think this is where the big ethical point is going to come into play, right? Psychoanalysis, insofar as it offers not only a way of talking about the event and this kind of not only corporeal collectivity, but in terms of effects too, right? Simulacra and phantasm and so on. There's a point in which Deleuze seems to be saying, and this is very interesting, is it's a huge break with phenomenology, right? But it does call to mind things like Sartre. there's a way in which psychoanalysis here offers us techniques of counter-actualization, sublimation, and symbolization. And this seems to be in relation to this point about the event being distinct from its actualization, as from the causes which produce it, using to its advantage the eternal part of excess over these causes, and the part which is left unaccomplished in its actualizations, skimming over its own field, making us its own offspring, right, producing us. And if it is indeed at this point where the actualization cannot accomplish, or the cause produced that the entire event resides, it is at the same point that it also offers itself to counter-actualization. It is here that our greatest freedom lies, the freedom by which we develop and lead the event to its completion and transmutation, and finally become masters of actualization and causes. What he seems to be saying here is that in this point about actualization and counter-actualization, these techniques that psychoanalysis offers us in terms of freedom are basically in terms of what's going to actualize, what's going to potentialize in a sense too, and the way in which that is going to affect corporeality, right? That seems to be where the major ethical point is being made, that the event insofar as it can crack, it can produce things, right? This excess and this eternal suggestion, bringing to mind the eternal return, the ways in which that is going to affect corporeality is where the ethical point is really going to be belayed.
The point is, though, that it can't be actualized. I think this is why it's a counter-actualization, as he says. So I think that's what I would say. It's a counter-actualization rather than actualization, and I think it's this. He's talking about the relation real. It comes out of the real, but it's not real. Either is it imaginary. Therefore, it can't be actualized, but it can go through this process of counter-actualization. He says that which allows to develop and lead the event to its completion and transmutation. So it's transmuted. It's taken from one thing to another. Finally become master of actualizations and causes, because we can't actually actualize it. Through a counter-actualization, we become master of actualization and causes. I think this is what he's saying psychoanalysis is and what it does.
But I think too that with counter-actualization, there's a point about actualization, right? Before the part you read, it is distinct from its actualization as from the causes which produce it, using to its advantage the eternal part of excess over these causes, and the part which is left unaccomplished in its actualizations. So I think there's a way in which there's still actualization taking place, but that is to go into the second causality, right? And this is kind of the point I'm kind of driving at, is in the counter-actualization and the actualization. I do think there's a sense of tension, just like there's a sense of tension with the incitation of the event, right? The other causality. And that problematic right there, if you like, that is obviously very Freudian, right? Tension and release. But that's what I think psychoanalysis offers us there, right? Is this techniques of how that tension will be released, but also the way in which things like sublimation, that right, things that are kind of latent in that, the way in which that potentiality will still kind of fall back on corporeality.
I think we just have to agree to disagree on this, because I just don't think there's a role for actualization. This is why he calls it counter-actualization. I think it's something that's been previously, like I said, I think he gave the example of the actor in playing a part, engaged in a process of counter-actualization. Is in his playing a part, and his character is not the actual person. He is he's playing a character, he's an actor playing a person playing a character. I think it's the process. Anyway, look, should we continue to the second part?
Yes, I would like to. I do want to come back to this though, because I think it's an interesting conception. I don't think actualization comes in here either, Jack, but I think if I'm able to get what you're saying. I think I agree with you. I think the wording is a bit different. But we should come back to that. I will continue on. 2. The second characteristic of the phantasm is its position in relation to the ego, or rather, the situation of the ego in the phantasm itself. It is indeed true that the phantasm finds its point of departure, or its author, in the phallic ego of secondary narcissism. But if the phantasm has the property of turning back on its author, what is the place of the ego in the phantasm, taking account of the unfolding or the development from which is inseparable from it? I'm going to re-say that. That's terrible. Really awkwardly written. But if the phantasm has the property of turning back on its author, what is the place of the ego in the phantasm, taking account of the unfolding or the development which is inseparable from it? Laplanche and Pontilus, in particular, have raised this problem under conditions which caution us about any easy response. Although ego may appear occasionally in the phantasm as acting, as undergoing an action, or as a third observing party, it is neither active nor passive and does not allow itself at any moment to be fixed in place, even if this place were reversible. The originary phantasm, quote, would be characterized by an absence of subjectivation, accompanying the presence of the subject in the scene. Any distribution of subject and object finds itself abolished. The subject does not aim at the object or its sign. It is included in the sequence of images. It is represented as participating in the setting without, in the forms closer to the originary phantasm, a place being assigned to it. These remarks have two advantages. On one hand, they emphasize that the phantasm is not a representation of either action or passion, but rather that it pertains to the entirely different domain. On the other hand, they show that if the ego is dissipated in it, it is not perhaps because of an identity of contraries or a reversal whereby the active would become passive, like the occurring in the becoming of depths and the infinite identity lies. Oh my. The ego and how it sits inside of all of this. The ego sits inside of the phantasm. Which footnote is it? Footnote is it? 2. 33rd, second. All right, 32. From Laplanche and Pontilus, I will just read this straight through. I'm going to read the French part. Quote, a father seduces a daughter. Such would be, for example, the concise formula of the phantasm of seduction. The mark of the primary process is not here the absence of organization, as occasionally said, but rather the particular character of the structure. It is a scenario with multiple entrances, where nothing says that the subject will find her position straight away in the term of daughter. We may also see it revolve around the term father, or even the term seduces. This is an essential point of the critique with which Laplanche and Pontilus address to the thesis of Susan Isaacs, the nature and function of fantasy. In developments in psychoanalysis, Isaacs, modeling the phantasm as the drive, gives to the subject a determined active place, even if the active reverts back to the passive and conversely. To this, Laplanche and Pontilus object. Quote, does it suffice to recognize in the phantasm of incorporation the equivalence between eating and being eaten, insofar as the idea of the subject's position is maintained, even if it is passive? Have we reached the most fundamental structure of the phantasm? All right, Jack, you got to tell me why I read that. Come on.
Yeah, I'll take the first crack then. So with that, there's this point about, just to read Deleuze's words, but if the phantasm is the property of turning back on its author, what is the place of the ego in the phantasm, taking account of the unfolding or the development which is inseparable from it? So there's this point about the and I think here of like Husserl and Sartre, right, especially transcendence of the ego. This whole distinction about with the transcendence of consciousness, what to do about the ego and how to understand it as either transcendental or something else, right? And this is the big critique Sartre on Husserl is that um, there's not a transcendental ego. That is to say, when consciousness reflects itself to itself, there's no ego sitting behind all of that. Instead, the ego is an object in the world that reflective consciousness discovers as the horizon of that world. So the I is the horizon of the world is a big point. But here Deleuze is going somewhere different altogether because in that theory there's no unconscious. Sartre wholesale rejects it, right? Again, fascinating move. But here Deleuze is raising the problem of, and he's talked about this a little bit with Ferlinghetti, if the phantasm is not a conscious thing, right? If this isn't being produced before the consciousness, then there's something altogether different going on. And with how he's laid out the event and sexual generation, right? Id, ego, and superego, respectively. And I believe he put the ego on the horizontal with the Stoic, if I remember correctly. So the problem he's basically raising here in an altogether new context then is, how do we discover the ego in the event if the event is not being produced, particularly encountered as an appearance before consciousness or an object before consciousness, right? If instead the ego itself is not only contingent on the event and the causality in its in its mixtures, but also inseparable from it, right? And this point about from Laplanche and Pontilus, where he writes, have raised the problem under conditions which caution us about an easy response. Although the ego may appear occasionally in the phantasm as acting, as undergoing an action, or as a third observing party, so basically as doing something, as being acted upon, or just kind of watching things, right? The very typical idea of it. What does the ego do? And this is a point throughout psychoanalysis, is the ego is supposed to direct desire, right? It's supposed to release the tension that the id is building up. The ego is neither active nor passive, and does not allow itself at any moment to be fixed in a place, even if this place were reversible. And this will be my final point before I turn it over. The interesting thing to me about this then is that with the ego here not active or passive, we have this suggestion of, again, an impassibility related to the event, related perhaps to the operator here in counteractualization. And at the same time, I think it's interesting here that we still can encounter the ego during the event, during the phantasm, as still being performed upon, as performing, or as just observing. And yet, that's not the whole of it, right?
The phrasing I like around this that he uses is that the ego is dissipated inside of it. Again, because it's an event. The ego is sort of dissipated within it. This idea that it's not here or there inside of the event, or like this, singular element, but instead dissipated within the entirety of it, almost, gaseous within gaseous. And because of that, we're able to sort of spot it where we want it, as sort of Laplanche and God, I'm going to get their names all back. Laplanche and Pontilus sort of talk through. They go in a different direction than he wants to, obviously, but it's an interesting concept. Derek, Kent, anyone, please.
Just go back to the beginning. It says the second characteristic of the phantasm. So he's talking about characteristics of the phantasm. So the first one is that it's essentially an event. pure event, a result of action and passion. So the second one is that who's now talking about the relation to the ego. And if we remember from previous sections, series, the ego is quite active. This active role, the ego of the infant has this role of kind of towards its mother, and then the Oedipal relationship towards the mother and the father. It's the secondary. I think that's what he calls the secondary narcissism. Anyway, so the second characteristic is it relates to ego, or rather situation of the ego in the phantasm itself. So he has this notion that the ego is within inside the phantasm. And it said, but if the phantasm has the property of turning back on its author, so the phantasm can act on it, but the phantasm can turn back onto the author. So I think the implication might be that it can have an effect on the author, which is the ego. But what is the place of the ego in phantasm? Take out and unfold or development, which is inseparable from it. I think this is the question he's asking here. Is in this one is about how does it relate to the ego? So we had that whole looking at the role of the ego towards the mother, and then that kind of schizoid state, and then the kind of then the relation to the father in that depressive state, and then the Oedipal engagement, trying to bring the whole thing together through the phallus, I would say. Question is, what is the relationship? The question he's asking, what is the relation of the phantasm towards ego? Where does it reside almost?
Well, and the phrasing that's interesting here as well with that is that it appears within the event as if it is acting or acted upon or observing, that it is not one and the same with the event, again, dissipated within it. To go back, as you're saying, to where the ego, the discussion around it came from, the phrasing in the previous series, last week's 29th, he outright says the ego is the first agent of primary narcissism. And what the ego does is it invests partial services with a sort of secondary narcissism. That's its job, is effectively like this narcissism transmitter, as it kind of does things. And so being sort of integrated so deeply into the phantasm that the phantasm has the ego as such, it puts the ego in the place of effectively being the thing that consistently is demanding that it exists and look at me and I'm right here type of thing, despite not really having any specific location within it.
Yeah, and I think the key to this paragraph, I think, is towards the end. He says they emphasize the remarks that went earlier. They emphasize that the phantasm is not a representation of either action or passion. So it doesn't. You can't apply any psychoanalytic theory to it. Perhaps he's saying. So, it's the phantasm that's been given off in the therapeutic session. I'm perhaps going too far in saying that, but can't be described as something that's happened, or to the result of that thing that happened. But he said it pertains to an entirely different domain. Now, what that domain is, we don't know yet, because that's probably hopefully in the next in the following sections.
Yeah, before I read that, sorry, go for it, Derek.
I was going to say that they showed that the ego dissipated in it. Anyway, sorry, yeah, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, Riveth, you had a thing.
I was going to put on my quasi analysis hat for a moment, and jokes aside, I just want to say that there is, again, the nested problematization that seems to be structuring this text, and the one that I'm going to tease out here is the one that's mentioned where there was a line that says that the subjectivity was displaced. And as you just mentioned, Derek, the dissipation, I'm not sure if that's the best word, but maybe it is, by the ego. And the ego seems to be this residual structure, once again. And this structure is put in place to uphold the, to support the notion of the phantasm. And then it sort of gets short-circuited by the phantasm. So it is in relation to it hierarchically, or rather in a way to support it, even though it's weakened by the fact that the ego, as it tries to essentially, you know, from a Lacanian standpoint, the ego is instantiated as part of a process, or as its very basis of existing as an object, the ego, is to substantiate the idea of the barred subjectivity. From the Lacanian standpoint, there is a relationship between the ego's position when the subjectivity is barred. So there is a kind of a redress here by Deleuze. So maybe you guys could think about or inform me of where this may be going in relation to the fact that there's an interesting point that he's making. But they try to hold each other up sort of in a very loose way, this idea that, right, the ego can't really bear the fact that all of a sudden the phantasm moves in a particular way that it didn't sort of anticipate, and it begins to dissipate, let's say literally, because the phantasm unfolds in a way that the ego couldn't control initially, or set out thinking that the phantasm was going to happen a certain way, but in fact, a multiplicity or some heterogeneity took place within the phantasm that threw off the ego, and the ego then tries to defend itself. Seems that that's, to me, the storyline. That's my interpretation there, the psychoanalytic interpretation.
The next paragraph, I think, is going to get into a lot of that. I think actually pretty quickly. It's a quick critique of Freud's sort of conception and where he went with it, including the two people he mentioned. And there's implications in there. I don't think it's directly of Lacan, but there's implications that have little knock-on effects. I'd say, why don't we get through the paragraph and then we'll see if we can come back to that, Riveth, because I really like the question. I think it's important for this section especially, but maybe to be a thing we also discuss in the future as well, because it's an ongoing thing from here out as we discuss where the ego sits, how it sits, subjectivity, and these kinds of things. But with that, I'm going to do the next paragraph. It's a little bit longer, and Hegel's mentioned, so this one's going to take us a little bit of analysis. Time Hegel's mentioned, basically. We cannot, however, follow these authors when they search for this beyond the active and the passive in a pre-nominal model, which would still make an appeal to the ego and would even refer explicitly to an autoerotic this side. The value of the pre-nominal, to punish oneself, to punish or to be punished, or better yet, to see oneself rather than to see or be seen, is well attested to in Freud's writing. But it does not seem to go beyond the point of view of an identity of contraries, either by means of a deeper appreciation of one or by a synthesis of both. That Freud remained attached to such a Hegelian position is beyond doubt, as we can see in the realm of language, from a thesis on primitive words endowed with contradictory sense. In fact, the transcendence of the active and the passive and the dissolution of an ego which corresponds to it do not occur along the lines of an infinite or reflective subjectivity. That which is beyond the active and the passive is not the prenominal, but the result of actions and passions, the surface effect, or the event. What appears in the phantasm is the movement by which the ego opens itself to the surface and liberates the acosmic, impersonal, and pre-individual singularities which it had imprisoned. It literally releases them like spores and bursts as it gets unburdened. We must interpret the expression neutral energy in the following manner. Neutral means pre-individual and impersonal, but does not qualify the state of an energy which would come to join a bottomless abyss. On the contrary, it refers to the singularities liberated from the ego through the narcissistic wound. This neutrality, that is to say, this movement by which singularities are emitted, or rather restored by an ego, which is dissolved or adsorbed at the surface, belongs essentially to the phantasm. This is the case in A Child is Being Beaten, or better, A Father is Seducing His Daughter, following the example invoked by Laplanche and Pontalis. Thus, the individuality of the ego merges with the event of the phantasm itself, even if that which the event represents in the phantasm is understood as another individual, or rather as a series of individuals through which the dissolved ego passes. The phantasm is inseparable, therefore, from the toss of the dice, or from the fortuitous instances which it enacts. And the famous grammatical transformations, such as those of President Schreiber or those of sadism or voyeurism, register each time the rising up of singularities distributed in disjunctions, all of them, in each case, communicating in the event, and all events communicating in one event, as for example in the case of the throws of the dice in the same cast. We find once again here an illustration of the principle of positive distance and the singularities which stake it out, and of an affirmative usage of the disjunctive synthesis, not a synthesis of contradiction. Oh my. Let's jump through. Take a beginning here.
I'd just like to mention something I put in the text message, which is the work of Abraham and Tarok. I don't know if Deleuze mentions them, but it's a good chance that Deleuze is kind of using their work as the basis for what he's saying. Anyway, in the paragraph just read, kind of the key point that's being made here is the relationship between the anonymous and pre-personal egos in relationship to the ego, and using the phantasm as the basis for relating the two. Just as a reminder, this is the idea of Dasein in Heidegger. It's the idea of the third kind of ego in Fink, where the first kind of ego is the mundane cogito of Descartes, and the second kind of ego is the transcendental ego. And so the third kind of ego is Dasein, and it's talked about as pre-personal and anonymous, and that becomes the tacit ego in Merleau-Ponty. So, this is going back to the idea of the pre-individual in relationship to the individual and the socius of Simondon.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I think he's just using the phantasm as a way of saying how these pre-personal, pre-individual, anonymous, Dasein-like elements that are the fragments of the ego are related to the ego through the phantasm. But something that I don't see in the text here, but is in Abraham and Tarok, is that the idea that the phantasm and the thing are like duals of each other. And so there's a breakup of the agency of the subject into these phantasms, but there's a complementary breakup of the id into what they call the thing, and basically they have the idea of the crypt, and so these things get put away in the kind of forgetfulness or the unconscious or oblivion, and so what psychoanalysis is about kind of retrieving these phantasms and the things from the unconscious.
I actually don't know how to follow that up. By the way, Kent, nice to have you back. Always good to hear you.
Thank you.
I've got to pick that stuff up. Their conception around the idea of crypt and everything. I opened up the QAnon link you put in there. It's I've never heard of it, and it's a really cool set of concepts of things to read.
So theirs was
real quick, Derek, go for it.
Go to the end of that paragraph. So I'm just trying to explicate the problem that Deleuze is setting out, that he wants to develop, he wants to kind of discuss in this paragraph you just read, Brooks. So he talks about the two authors, the Laplanche and Pontilis. So they're saying two things. They're saying that fundamentally they emphasize the phantasm is not a representation of either action or passion. So it pertains to an entirely different domain. That's one thing. And they show that the ego is dissipated. It is not because of identity of contraries. So the action and passion are contrary to each other. It's not because of that. A reversal whereby the active would become passive. One can imagine perhaps the opposite might occur. It says we cannot, so to go on to this paragraph, we cannot follow these authors when they search for this beyond the active and the passive in a pronominal model. So he says he doesn't want to go beyond this, active and passive, go beyond that in a pronominal model, which I'm not sure what that means. I mean, apart from it relates to
pronouns.
Relates to a pronoun, yeah. So the ego stands for, can be studied, can be represented. Well, it's a idea of pronominal model might be one of representation.
I feel like a pronominal model would be one of representation that's very particular in the sense of Derek, Brooks, Kent, as things within this, versus a model that just has person, us, me, like even any of that. There's a pronominal model there that because it appeals naturally to an ego, to a singular ego inside of all of this. It feels like that's the thing. I punish myself. Derek punishes other people. That these things, the way that it gets written, the way that we talk about it, is an assumed pronominal model.
Yeah, and just to continue, because I think what he's saying, it does not seem to go beyond the point of view of an identity of contraries. So I think this identity of contraries, so this notion of active and passive, so either by a deep appreciation of one, i.e. the active over the passive, or vice versa, or bringing them both together in a synthesis. I think that's why this is why it says Freud remained attached to such a Hegelian position, in which those two terms are kind of it's almost I'm not sure if that's correct. This is correct. I'm going to say it's almost like a dialectical engagement with those two terms as the two opposites to each other in the realm. So that Freud. So he said that Freud remained attached to such a Hegelian position beyond doubt, as we can see in the realm of language from a thesis on primitive word. Anyway, so he was kind of interested in the kind of the words themselves and what they expressed. But I think what Deleuze wants to talk about is the active and the passive, and he says the transcendence of the active and passive dissolution of ego do not occur along the lines of an infinite or reflected subjectivity. He says that which is beyond the active and passive is not the pronominal, but the result of actions and passions. So I think what he's saying is that the previous notion of active and passive might be investigated in that kind of Hegelian sense in terms of the terms themselves and how they might be, one might be valued over another, or they might be synthesized into a kind of final meaning. It says what's beyond the active and passive is the result of action passive, the surface effect or the event. So the two things brought together, they give off this, the result of that, them coming together is this surface effect or the event.
Well, and it's specifically around this because it's the use of synthesized is important. He brings up Hegel, and it's intended as a no, I'm not doing that kind of thing, because we're not talking about a synthesis of contradiction. To go back, we're talking about the disjunctive synthesis, which essentially is affirmation, is how these elements get synthesized. Right? Affirmative distance and affirmation of it. I think I'm trying to find a way to put it simply. The way Nietzsche talked about utilizing his health to talk of sickness, or to understand it, and his sickness to talk of health, it's affirming the distance between them. At this point, that's a disjunctive synthesis versus one of a synthesis of contradiction, where these things are opposites, and then I need to find the commonalities between them. It's instead affirming the distance. That play is a really interesting here because, again, he's moving back into this concept of positive distance, again, moving back into the way that these events communicate and how they play, but he's adding in the ego into these events, which is saying effectively that the ego is produced as part of this, belongs to the phantasm, is part of the phantasm, and sort of plays in this space of basically being able to forever sort of ramify and coordinate and do whatever it needs to with a shit ton of series in order to sort of justify its own existence and continue that communication. The self-justifying ego narcissism, essentially, within that. That's how I'm reading it.
Because he says the individuality of the ego merges with the event of the phantasm. So this is this, as you say, this disjunctive synthesis merges with that. And then he goes on to say the phantasm is separable from the toss of the dice from the fortuitous impotence. So this is the tantum, eventum tantum. I can't remember which way around that is.
Eventum tantum. So, yeah.
Which is it's the kind of universal event, shall we call it, or the all events in one.
The event to end all events.
Right, yeah, that's good way of saying it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting phrasing, as he says here. The rising up of singularities distributed in disjunctions, all of them in each case, communicating in the event, and all events communicating in one event, as for example, in the case of the throws of the dice in the same cast. The play of that, the game, to go back to when he talks about the game and how it works. There's a really... the phantasm effectively is this ramified chance within all of this.
It seems to be this point about subjectivity in that, right? I mean, he writes, in fact, the transcendence of the active and the passive and the dissolution of an ego which corresponds to it do not occur along the lines of an infinite or reflected subjectivity. That which is beyond the active and passive is not the pronominal, but the result of actions and passions, the surface effect or the event, which lines up squarely with what he was saying from Laplanche and Pentalis about the absence of subjectivation accompanying the presence of the subject in the scene. The distribution of subject and object find itself abolished. So I think a lot of what he's teeing up here is that, and this goes back to sublimation and that, right, and even symbolization in a sense. It seems like he's saying that that which the ego sort of, I mean, with sublimation, right, like there are things that won't necessarily be expressed because of the way the ego is going to negotiate between pleasure and reality, right? And there's a way in which that can still be expressed, but in terms of a latency, right? It doesn't necessarily go away, but there's a way in which the arrangements are being managed. And this point about neutrality, and that seems to be that with the phantasm, the ego actually finds itself basically opening up that which it had relegated, right? And this seems to square up with the point about sublimation, and that the counter-actualization would especially here seem to be that the way in which the ego had been, to put in Simondan terms, kind of managing the pre-individual and that which will be individuated, actualized, yeah. Now it finds itself actually kind of undoing that, right? So now you've got this tension between those two processes that is actually one process.
A really interesting phrasing around all of this. And again, returning it back also to neutral energy, with neutral meaning pre-individual and impersonal, does not qualify the state of energy, which would come to join a bottomless abyss. It refers to the singularities liberated from the ego through the narcissistic wound. Really, I'm going to have to go through and reread this. I thought I understood this section. I just did not. I do want to move to the next paragraph, though, which is the third element of this. If anyone has any last notes or thoughts on this before I charge ahead, now would be the time.
I think just to say that number 2, it seems to be setting out the structure on the phantasm and the place of the ego within that. It's good to try and think each characteristic as we go through it. I think just so we know, just so we're familiar with them.
Yeah.
First, it's an event, and second, it's an event within which the ego sits, but the event is kind of a neutrality. Anyway, I don't want to carry on.
No, it's spot on. We're going through the 3 characteristics of what a phantasm is, and because the rest of the book is going to continue off of this. It's laying the groundwork, utilizing the groundwork laid before to start again. The new foundation is that this first element is that phantasms are pure events, and they differ in nature from real bodies and from bodies and real causes. They're noematic attributes of states of affairs. I think is an interesting. It's not states of affairs, qualities, psychological lives, or logical concepts. Really interesting concept. Second part is that the ego. Second characteristic, the ego is dissipated within it and situated within this phantasm. May appear as acting or acted upon or observing, but since the phantasm is pure event, the ego is dissipated within it. Now we move to the third characteristic, which is significantly important. So I'm just going to go ahead and dive in. It is not an accident that the development inherent in the phantasm is expressed in a play of grammatical transformations. The phantasm event is distinguished from the corresponding state of affairs, whether it is real or possible. Phantasm represents the event according to its essence, that is, as a noematic attribute, distinct from the actions, passions, and qualities of the states of affairs. But the phantasm represents another and no less essential aspect as well. pardon me, according to which the event is that which may be expressed by the proposition. Freud pointed this out in saying that the phantasmatic material, in the representation of the parental coitus, for example, has an affinity to verbal images. It is not the case that the phantasm is said or signified. The event presents as many differences from the propositions which express it as from the state of affairs in which it occurs. The fact is, though, that it does not exist outside of a proposition which is at least possible, even if this proposition has all of the characteristics of a paradox or nonsense. It also inheres in a particular element of the proposition. This element is the verb, the infinitive form of the verb. The phantasm is inseparable from the infinitive mode of the verb and bears witness thereby to the pure event. But in light of the relations and complex connections between the expression and the expressed, between the interiority of the expressor and the exteriority of the expressed, between the verb as it appears in language and the verb as it subsists in being, we must conceive of an infinitive which is not yet caught up in the play of grammatical determinations, an infinitive independent not only of all persons, but of all time, every mood, every voice, passive, active, and collective. This would be a neutral infinitive for the pure event, distance, aeon, representing the extra-propositional aspect of all possible positions, or the aggregate of ontological problems and questions which correspond to language. From this pure and undetermined infinitive, voices, moods, tenses, and persons will be engendered. Each of them will be engendered within disjunctions representing in the phantasm a variable combination of singular points, and constructing around these singularities an instance of solution to the specific problem. Problem of birth, of the difference of the sexes, of the problem of death. Luce Irigaray, in a short article, after having noted the essential relation between the phantasm and the infinitive verb, analyzes several examples of such a genesis. Once an infinitive has been determined in a phantasm, for example, to live, to absorb, to give, she investigates several types of connection: the subject-object connection, the active-passive conjunction, the affirmation-negation disjunction, or the type of temporalization of which each one of these verbs is capable. To live, for example, has a subject, but one that is not an agent and that has no differentiated object. She is therefore able to classify these verbs in an order which runs from the least to the most determined, as if a general infinitive, which is taken to be pure, were progressively specified according to a differentiation of formal grammatical relations. This is how aeon is peopled by events at the level of singularities, which are distributed over its infinitive line. We have attempted to show in a similar way that the verb goes from a pure infinitive, opened onto a question of such, to a present indicative, closed onto a designation of a state of affairs or a solution case. The former opens and unfolds the ring of the proposition, the latter closes it up, and between the two, all the vocalizations, modalizations, temporalizations, and personalizations are deployed, together with the transformations proper to each case according to a generalized grammatical perspectivism. That's a fun paragraph. So a couple lines here that are important. The phantasm itself is the event as expressed, not as it's said, not as it's signified, within any proposition. The phantasm exists there. It inheres inside of this infinitive as he goes into length. And it has no care of mood, tense, person, voice, and all of that. Again, to go back to this neutral energy it has, the way the infinitive plays, it doesn't care about anything. To death, to live, as they say. It goes through to live, for example, has a subject, but one that is not an agent and has no differentiated object. This is the third characteristic of the phantasm. It's a really long paragraph, but it's actually a fairly crisp one, I think. There's some really good examples in. Please, I'm giving the floor. I can also not open the floor. Continue to talk.
Just like to point out the fact that there's connection, conjunction, disjunction that turn up in anti-Oedipus in that paragraph.
It is really hard not to bring that up, but yes, Kent, spot on. It's the specific order he gives here is really interesting.
I guess one thing that sticks out to me is so several sections again, right? Several sections ago, you start out by saying, right, we have to kind of explain how language comes in all at once, right, and how the event is formed. And I'm kind of reminded of that here because when I read this bit about leading into the third characteristic, where Deleuze writes, in each case, communicating in the event and all events communicating in one event, as for example, in the case of the throws of the dice in the same cast. And he goes into the disjunctive synthesis and that, but the interesting thing to me here is that this top sentence and that about grammatical transformations, it reads to me like the communication of effects, right, and thereby the communication of events is expressed in the play of grammatical transformations. It almost sounds like what he's saying here is that, if you like, when we encounter language in that, it's expressing, or it is the expressed of events, of effects, right? And that's probably something he's gone over before, but I think it's interesting to find that here as a characteristic of the phantasm, that the relationship to language and grammatical transformation more especially is an expression of the communication of effects.
Yeah, so just to continue that, what you're saying about the so he says just towards the beginning of this section, he says the event is that which may be expressed by the proposition. He said it's not that if the phantasm has been said or signified, it's not. It doesn't come out of the proposition as such. It doesn't exist outside the proposition. He said the element. So he said the fact is that it doesn't exist outside of proposition, which is at least possible. This proposition has all the characteristics apparently. He said the phantasm inheres in a particular element of the proposition. So this is where you will find the phantasm, and this element is the verb, and the infinitive form of the verb, to be precise. The phantasm is inseparable from the infinitive mode of the verb and bears witness thereby to the pure event. So in the expression of the infinitive mode of the verb, it bears witness to the pure event. So it's kind of like, in a sense, beside themselves. The expression of the pure, of the infinitive verb is witness to the pure event. And it's a verb of a particular kind as well, infinitive verb of a particular kind. It's a neutral infinitive, devoid of all the like what he calls grammatical determinations of voice, mood, etc. So it's a kind of neutral. So it's this neutrality which again keeps being emphasized. I think in each of these three characteristics of phantasm, the idea of neutrality has been expressed in some way. Again, the verb. So in speaking, in the expression of propositions, the phantasm present in the verb, but it's a kind of neutral verb, devoid of all these other characteristics. says from this pure and undetermined infinitive, voices, moods, tenses, and persons will be engendered. So it starts from this, and then from that, we then go towards the different characteristics in terms of voice, moods, tenses, persons will be engendered. They're engendered, so it has this very particular, it's quite active, well, I don't know if that's the right word, but it gives rise to things within the proposition in this kind of neutral verb. Each one of them will be engendered within disjunctions, representing in the phantasm of, and we go back to previous sentences, so this notion of disjunctive synthesis, the active and the passive, together they're a disjunctive synthesis. And this is the model he's developing. So he's taking the model from the previous one and developing it further here in terms of language. At the end, he says, so he talks about that. He gives an example of Luce Irigaray article in which this very relationship between the problem, between the phantasm and infinitive was analysed. He goes on to say, we have at the end of this section, paragraph, so he says we attempted to show in a similar way that the verb goes from a pure infinitive opened onto a question subject to a present indicative closed onto a designation of a state of affairs or a solution case. It goes from this neutral verb, works towards the expression of the voice, moods, tenses, etc. Or he says in this case the present indicative. So through this, we have this notion of a designation of a state of affairs. A solution case. The former opens and folds the ring of the proposition. So the ring of the proposition goes right back to that notion of the notation, manifestation, signification. Yeah, that's the ring of the proposition, and but also closes it. And I think I imagine what closes the ring of proposition is sense. That's what I'm imagining.
Seems like it's because the infinitive verb opens on the question, it opens the circle of the proposition. The infinitive essentially does that. Through here we sort of have this dynamic genesis is taking place. We now have the phantasm, and the designation, again, the sense made through the three elements, as you're saying, closes that circle back up. It's solution to the proposition, more or less. And the phantasm is generated by the proposition, or sort of lives there at the surface, and out comes this stuff out the other side. And this organization, as he says here at the very end here, where is the wording? He's got, I know it was on this. I know it was in this paragraph. Maybe not. I thought the phrasing was going to be. You essentially have at that point the grammatical perspective that's sort of generated by this. The voice, mood, tense, person, things like that. It's a little earlier. Now I'm completely, yeah. Now I'm going down a rabbit hole myself. That's fine. How we're doing.
While you're doing that, can I come up from?
Please.
Say a few closing remarks that I'll have to go after this. For me, at least. Firstly, this is a beautiful paragraph, just, really well written and quite, has this complexity level of complexity and the the aesthetics that could come about from psychoanalysis. Lucia Irgare is a, and so my points is actually, I'm setting this up for the fact that Deleuze has been claimed by, Laurel has claimed that Deleuze has not gone far enough at times. And what came to mind, particularly as Derek was tearing through the propositional notions, both in the text and working through them, is that, again, we have this folding from an ontological pointer, from the ontological idea of aeon into the telos of the subject and a teleological kind of spatialization of the phantasm taking shape through propositions. The subjectivity arises in the teleological identification, and language is the tool by which the perceptions begin to take place. That's what I'm gathering here on a wide scope. The reason I'm saying all of this is because and my mind wants to go to address the question. But before I do that, there is the problemization again of the spatial aspect, and tense and aspect came to mind when you know, talking about the importance of language here, and tense having a kind of temporality, and aspect dealing with maybe other things like spatialization, the aspect of the language putting things within relation to reference, deictic ideas of there, here, those type of words for the aspect. So there's the interplay there on that dimension of language. And I'm chopping this up a little bit, but it would be interesting to look at some of this work that Deleuze is referring to, Irigare's work.
Tougher to find. I just spent a second Googling.
Yeah.
Not super easy to find. Just to mention, not super easy to find.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that, but I might not, because on the ontological level, the question is, the that comes to mind for me is the diminution or the move into a assemblage of the subject and the inner workings of an ego. All of this is kind of like taking place in the event of the teleological phantasm. The event, be it social, the bodies that are there, where Deleuze still early on made reference to a ground that is ontological, kind of aeonic notion. that the being is then thrown into this event, and so all these different structures arise teleologically. But there is a excuse me, an important question around the ontos of the being, and therefore freedom of movement. It feels like the subject can freeze up amidst all of this that is happening to it, that it associates with, and lose its sense of the fluidity or the volition that comes with the ontological ground. So I'm not sure if Deleuze goes far enough, or if he's still kind of trapped in the web.
Don't have an answer myself. But when we start talking about the subject, the thing I was looking at when you started, I think comes back to sort of talk about this. As we get through this third element of the dynamic genesis, the third element of the phantasm, we're moving through these things. What begins to happen with this infinitive, with this generation of the phantasm, the phrasing, from this pure and undetermined infinitive, voices, moods, tenses, and persons will be engendered. At this point, we begin creating the play set that we sort of are defining as ourselves or around us. Each one of them will be engendered with disjunctions, representing, in the phantasm, a variable combination of singular points, and constructing around these singularities an instance of solution to the specific problem. The problem of birth, different sections, different problem of death. This element sort of on its own naturally organizes this grammatical perspectivist take that the phantasm is, responsible is the wrong word, but at the nexus of, is at the center of, at production, in the production of. It's a really interesting sort of play when we talk about the ego and how the subject is produced alongside this. I would almost be hesitant to say that the ego loses something or the subject loses a sense ontologically, but instead say that it's the nature of ontological production of the subject that this happens, that these things are happening in concert as such. So it's a really interesting, again, direction to take it when we start playing with infinitives and the problem of it and what it's trying to solve, and as we play through it. Because, again, we're talking about things that, the playing with aeon, for example. Aeon itself is filled with just an extraordinary number of events in this specification of infinitives, from the least determined that are far out, because again, it's infinitely divided, all the way to ones that are hyper determined, very specific. And this is where we have the singularities, these collective sort of bits of points that become distributed over this infinite line. This infinitive allows us to play inside of aeon, and the production of the subject and the phantasm seems to come from that, and we assign to it this sort of perspectivist take of mood, voice, tense, and person that gives it the reality necessary for us to pretend that it's real. I don't know, maybe I'm phrasing that wrong. Derek, Jack, Panto, Kent muted. Anyone else, please? A lot was said there. Nemo, welcome.
Yeah, I just think that. Can you hear me? I'm using my headphones.
You're good. You're good.
I just think that you get to the end of like any huge overarching look at reality, any ontological perspective. I think that the best thing that you can say is that it's just a solid look at it. Like even in physics, the string theories, these theoretical perspectives on things, you get to the end of it, and all of you can say, well, with this number of threads, I have a solidarity. My perspective has some solidarity to it, and that's the greatest thing that you can brag about. I mean, so there's kind of a fluidity in that. Or you can look at it and say that it actually breaks down to being incoherent and not actually, you can look at it from like, but I mean, I honestly, I think that you get to the end of anything and you're like, yeah, that was a good look at it. And then, go about your business, right? As you see fit to from there, right? Like just a very global look at it.
Derek, Jack? We're not done yet, Jack. We have one more paragraph after this.
I'm just gonna, never mind. If you read the last paragraph, then we can
discuss.
discuss.
Yeah, fair enough. I'll charge through it. We're going to go long. We're going over. We're going to 12:30. We'll finish then, if we're not done earlier. But then a simpler task is imposed, namely, to determine the phantasm's point of birth, and, through this, its real relation to language. This question is nominal or terminological to the extent that it is about the use of the word phantasm. But it engages other things as well, since it fixes their use in relation to a particular moment, allegedly making it necessary in the course of the dynamic genesis. For example, Susan Isaacs, following Melanie Klein, already employs the word phantasm in order to indicate the relation of introjected and projected objects in the schizoid position, at a moment in which the sexual drives are in league with the elementary drives. It is therefore inevitable that phantasms have only an indirect and tardive relation to language, and that when they are verbalized afterwards, the verbalization occurs in accordance with ready-made grammatical forms. Laplanche and Pontalis establish the phantasm, along with autoeroticism, and link it to the moment in which the sexual drives disengage themselves from the alimentary model and abandon every natural object. Hence, the importance they attach to the pronominal and the sense they give to the grammatical transformations as such in the non-localizable position of the subject. Finally, Melanie Klein does make an important remark, despite her very extensive use of the word phantasm. She often says that symbolism is the foundation of every phantasm, and that the development of the phantasmatic life is hindered by the persistence of the schizoid and depressive positions. It seems to us precisely that the phantasm, properly speaking, finds its origin only in the ego of the secondary narcissism, along with the narcissistic wound, the neutralization, the symbolization, and the sublimation which ensue. In this sense, it is inseparable not only from grammatical transformation, but also from the neutral infinitive as the ideational material of these transformations. Phantasm is a surface phenomenon, and, moreover, a phenomenon which is formed at a certain moment in the development of surfaces. For this reason, we have opted for the word simulacrum in order to designate the objects of depth, which are already no longer natural objects, as well as the becoming which corresponds to them and the reversals by which they are characterized. We choose idle in order to designate the object of the heights in its adventures. We choose image in order to designate that which pertains to partial corporeal surfaces, including the initial problem of their phallic coordination, the good intention. Please, Derek.
Give up. No. Just one thought. He talks about he's talking about the problem of language, the kind of expressing what the what he's talking about, what he calls the real relation to language, and ends up by naming the depth, the thing of the object of the depth, the object of the height, and object of the surface. So he talks about the simulacrum, the idol, and the image. So he doesn't. I'm not completely clear why suddenly he goes into this, but it seems to be that there are. So prior to that, he's saying it seems that the phantasm is placed at different levels. So he gives the example of Susan Isaacs. So he places the phantasm in the depth. So he says the phantasm, he says, employs the word phantasm in order to indicate the relation introjected projected objects in a schizoid position. Then Laplanche and Ponce established phantasm along with autoeroticism. Link it to the moment in which the sexual drive is disengaged from elementary model, abandon every natural object. I'm not sure what that level, where that takes us, but then finally, Melanie Klein talks about symbolism. So it's attached to something else. So as a symbol, it becomes symbolized by something else. And I think this seems to be that the term phantasm, one of the things that he hasn't done is actually say what a phantasm is. I mean, I think and I think that seems to be the kind of a problem internal to the phantasm, is that it's very difficult to actually say what it is. I wonder if that's intrinsic to the idea of what a phantasm is. So
feels like it. I mean, you're talking about the great difficulty he's got here is, as he says, the ability to sort of say the word or what the word means or what he's referring to. He's being very specific. It's very difficult to actually use the word properly, but he's doing it because it engages other things well, since it fixes this use in relation to a particular moment, allegedly making it necessary in the course of the dynamic genesis. It's a really interesting thing that sort of it insists upon its own usage once it's been used, because it's referring to things that it needs to be used with. It's a kind of a funny set of words he's using here.
So he says it finds its the phantasm finds its origin only in the ego, the secondary narcissism. I just wonder, could you just remind us what you find secondary narcissism earlier, Brooks? And if you could just, if you can, I don't know if you can remind us of what that means, secondary narcissism.
Yeah, so that the phrasing behind secondary narcissism comes from very specifically, give me 2 seconds, I've got a bunch of things I've searched for. The secondary narcissism is the wound of it. To go back to the 29th series, the ego is first agent of primary narcissism in the depths, which is the body without organs, then coordinates and invests partial surfaces with libidinal secondary narcissism. The secondary narcissism comes after the BW, after the production, and is basically the investment of the partial surfaces.
Right.
And so that's why the phantasm being a surface phenomenon makes sense that it would play with more the secondary or the wound, as he phrases it as well. These elements that are on the surface, alongside Oedipus, alongside Hercules.
I just think it suddenly becomes perhaps clear why he then ends up with this naming exercise, because I think this is what he wants to do. He wants to say in particular what he wants to give a particular name to each thing within this structure of depth, surface, and height, because the phantasm seems, as you say, quite a mobile term, and it's one that different individuals seem to place it at different levels. And I think so he doesn't attempt to then say where the phantasm is, although he does say it's at the does actually say where it is. I think it's a surface phenomenon. It's a phenomenon of the surface. Something happens at the surface.
Well, it's formed specifically, and he goes on, surface phenomenon, and moreover a phenomenon which is formed at a certain moment in the development of surfaces.
Yeah. It's formed at a moment, so it's not a kind of resident, shall we say. But I just wanted to say that. So I think this is why he then goes on to name objective depth of the simulacrum, and then the idle to designate the object of the heights, and the image pertains to partial corporeal surfaces. So I think this is why he then goes on to sort of, in a sense, nail down the actual words he wants to use for each of these different levels.
And it's inseparable wholly from the infinitive and from these grammatical transformations. You can't pull it away from it, because essentially it's with the infinitive and also the fodder and ideational material for the grammatical transformations and well. So it's just very deeply tied into there.
I just wonder though, if you go back to the beginning of this paragraph, it calls it a simpler task to determine the phantasm's point of birth. So where does it arise? Through this, its real relation to language. So I'm just reading that to me how it should be expressed, and he says he has these different ways in which it's expressed in terms of the phantasm is something of the depth, something of the heights, perhaps, etc., etc. He says its birth, or it is at the surface.
It's the secondary narcissism. That's why I keep going back to that. I think it's correct. Because the ego's formed the primary narcissism, but it's not there. That's not where it comes. It's because that's still depths. It's still playing a different place. But at some point, the ego becomes invested in the surfaces, and at that point, the phantom arises. This is with all this other shit that kind of gets produced with it. This constellation of elements. It's not a singular element. It's not an object. It's not a bit. It's not a thing. It's not like the ego. It is a constellation of all these others. The way that it operates, it plays within all of these things. But for me, it's the phantom arises with the ego of secondary narcissism. I did that. I've made that to live. What is the thing that lives? What is the thing that dies? That's secondary narcissism, not primary, which is interesting as a thing, because it's a very clean line to sort of separate the two.
Yeah, so I think perhaps the takeaway here is that this character. So we've already spoken about its two elements within this third characteristic, but the second one is that it is separable from grammatical transformations and from the neutral infinitive, as that which brings about the ideation, as he calls the ideation of these transformations. Therefore, it's a surface phenomenon. It goes, like I say, I think that's for what's to come. He wants to then nail down. He's already used these. They're not new terms he's using here. He then wants to. He said this is why he's opted for the word simulacrum. So I think this is why he's used the word simulacrum to get to the depth. And
because the ego is in the depths. So to go back and reread a little bit from Good Intentions, the ego as factor of the primary narcissism is initially lodged in the depths, in the vesicle itself, or the body without organs. But it is able to attain independence only in the autoeroticism of partial surfaces and all the small egos which haunt them. The real test of the ego then lies in the problem of coordination, and thus of its own coordination, when the libido, as superficial energy, invests it in a secondary narcissism. And as we earlier suggested, this phallic coordination of surfaces and of the ego itself on the surface is accompanied by operations which are qualified as Oedipal. This is what we must analyze. This seems to be pointing at this idea of the primary, the ego, these things. It's bodies. It's within the bodies, it's lodged in the. But at some point, we sort of give it this secondary nature through his example here, the Oedipalization, the good intentions of Oedipus. But as doing so, we also sort of doom it to the secondary narcissism and the production of the phantasm, which then kind of goes on to enslave it. Sorry to interrupt, Derek. The secondary narcissism thing, it's a really interesting thing to dive into, and it's odd.
I agree, yeah. Okay, good.
Interesting. Yeah, so the phrasing essentially puts it at the production of this secondary narcissism. Is where it ends. It's a line here. We choose image in order to designate that which pertains to partial corporeal surfaces, including the initial problem of their phallic coordination, their good intention. All right. Any questions, thoughts, anything on this before I close out? Because we could spend forever discussing this right now. This already gave me a great deal to sort of redigest, and I've got to go back through and reread this because next week we move into thought as a thing, and the phantasm is pretty much the basis of thought. Get that going. That'll be fun. Please, any questions? Now would be the time. Type away, ask questions, whatever it is. I see Ollie's typing a thing. Feel free. And, oh, Ollie's typing thanks. You are welcome, Ollie. But I think with that, Jack, do you have anything?
Yeah, just as a closing remark, I'd like to respond in terms of Nietzsche and say that it has been for the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective a day beyond good.
Jesus Christ. Every single day. Is this the new thing for us? Is it what we're doing?
I don't know what you're talking about. Nietzsche said that, not me.
I don't drink enough coffee. Drink more coffee in the morning.
There's a line here that says that she says that according to Melanie Klein, symbolism is the foundation of every phantasm. Does that kind of like indicate that it's the secondary narcissism is beginning to acquire this ability for symbolism and maybe related to language?
So I'll try to answer that because that's actually a really interesting question. There's someone here who probably understands Freud and Lacan better than me, or of the different stages of, or Melanie Klein better than me, or the different stages of this. The nature of the secondary narcissism, the way symbolism works, especially within Lacan, is actually when we have that secondary narcissism, the symbolism can only be given to us by a master signifier, by a breach, by a wound, whatever it is, that basically scars the ego and gives us that sort of secondary element, which gives us symbolism. So when she says that symbolism is the foundation of every phantasm, it is these things that are one step removed from the direct states of affairs or from any of that. That's how I read that section. Please, anyone wants to sort of ring in.
This kind of wound, is that related to the death instinct, or the self-destructive, or the destructive drive?
That one I don't know. I can't answer confidently enough.
I don't really know, but I think that it's like in Lacanian theory, it's like the imagos of the fractured body, and so no, I don't think it is the death drive or anything like that. I think it's like I think it's a separate thing. It's like a failure, an internal failure from what you think that you should be.
Yeah,
But
it's
it
with
could be
Lacan.
related to the lack, though, right? It could be related to Lacan's lack.
So Lacan's lack comes from, like, all of these things are born in the same moment. Baby breastfeeding, like this is the scar that happens. A baby breastfeeds and it goes, oh, this is so fucking great. I want this forever. And then it realizes it can't have it. And it knows that suddenly understands the difference between sort of an idealized representation and the reality of things. That split, that break, and that's a really just awful way to explain it. But that break is kind of where the secondary narcissism comes in. We get the master signifier. We get sort of this chain of symbolization. And as such, we now can relate to the world rather than the real, and we can never go back. And the world we recognize through the imaginary, the symbols, the fantasies of it, rather than what it actually is, because we can never reconnect what it actually is.
Yeah, perhaps the phantasm is a kind of first develops out of this first experience of the reality principle, right? The primary narcissism is obsessed with the pleasure principle, but secondary narcissism that where the phantasm develops maybe is the wound that is the instigator, the stimulus for the experience of the reality principle.
I'd have to think about that. I like that connection I hadn't made. See, Riveth is typing away. We'll give Riveth a moment, and then we will bounce after. Oh, gotta go. There we go. Everyone's taken off. That's fine. And I thank all of you for joining us today. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Same Deleuze time, same Deleuze channel for the 31st series of Thought. Then.
Thank you very much.